what is the legacy of colonialism, both in the societies of former colonies, but also in the societies of former colonial powers? And what is needed in order to achieve an egalitarian and forward-looking dialogue between those societies in Europe and in Africa? These are the two main questions which we hope to find some answers to in the next panel, which starts right now. And we are very fortunate to be able to welcome guests from afar and nearer by to join us on stage. Nwando Achebe is from Michigan State University in East Lansing. Philip Murphy is from the Institute for Commonwealth Studies in London. Antje Leendertse joins us from the German Foreign Office. And James Shikwati is from the help me? IREN, Interregional Economic Network in Kenya, based in Nairobi, of course. And as moderator of the panel, Christine Gerberding of the North German public broadcaster. So, with these few words, may I invite you to come onto the stage. Thank you for being here.
Does it matter where we sit? Does it matter where we sit?
Müssen wir sagen?
Ja, bitte.
Dahin?
Would you write it?
Good.
Yes, Mr. Vogelmeck, thank you very much for your kind introduction. Good to have you all here. Thank you for coming. And I felt that we should start about discussing the question of narratives and storytelling. And I would like to start with a quote of Nwando Achebe, your father actually, who said, "It is the storyteller who makes us what we are, who creates history." And I think being at a panel and in a discussion with politicians and historians, I think this might be the crucial point, because the storyteller defines culture, people, history. So the narrative probably differs in Europe and Africa, so I think this is probably the core point we should start off. Mrs. Achebe, I started with quoting your father, but I'd like to continue with quoting you. In one of the issues of the Journal of West African History you you had one whole volume discussing you focused on the past is our strength. So what kind of past would you think West Africa should refer to? I know it's a big question, but maybe you can sort of make it concrete on one example.
Well, thank you so very much for having me. I'm extremely honored and privileged to have been asked to participate in this debate, and just feel, honored to be here. So when you talk about the past as our strength, and what past am I talking about? You started earlier on by quoting a quote from my father: "The storytellers are the historians." And I'd like to talk about another quote about whose stories are being told, whose histories. And the Igbo have a proverb that says that until lions have their own historians, the story of the hunt will always favor the hunter as opposed to the hunted, right? So when I talk about the past is our strength, I am talking about Africa's pre-colonial past. That is our strength. Before we as Africans can move forward, we need to know from whence we have come. The Igbo say that you will not know where the rain began to beat you. You will not know when the sun dried your skin if you don't know when the rain began to beat you. So for me, when I talk about strength, I talk about our history, African history on African terms. Africans conceptualizing their own history for the world to acknowledge, not the other way around. Unfortunately, as Africans, our stories have been written by others. And those others who have written our histories have not written our histories in ways in which Africans recognize themselves in those histories. Hence, my challenge as an Africanist historian who conceptualizes African history from within, my challenge is to tell our stories, to tell our strength from our own point of view.
Professor Murphy, since you studied the history of Commonwealth, we just heard telling the African story from African terms. This is probably the same big question, but still looking at the history of the Commonwealth, from what terms is now the perception of the history of the Commonwealth?
I think one of the problems with the Commonwealth today is that ostensibly it should be a perfect vehicle for a dialogue between Britain and its former colonies about that history. In practice, it isn't. In practice, the Commonwealth is deeply risk-averse and will do anything to avoid talking about history. In a sense, it's tried recently to organize celebrations for its 70th birthday. Of course, it isn't 70, it's much older than that. It has a deep imperial past, but it likes to portray itself as sort of springing fresh and new and innocent into the world in 1949 when India was allowed to remain as a republic. And I think this is it's a huge shame because the Commonwealth at the moment is not particularly good at anything very much. It tries to set itself up as an organization promoting aid, democracy, the rule of law, gender rights, human rights. In effect, it has such a tiny budget, it's incapable of doing any of those things. I've in the past described the Commonwealth as a sort of homeopathic medicine of international organizations. It's a sort of the idea that this tiny little drop of international activity could do all of these wonderful, wonderful things. But it really misses a huge opportunity to engage with its past, and that's partly the result of a British desire to avoid that conversation. Many African states, for example, there are dialogues at the moment with the Kenian government about returning documents that were spirited out of Kenya on independence in 1963. Thousands of documents from Britain's former colonies were suddenly revealed to have been stored away in 2013. Kenya has been at the forefront of demanding the return of those. And the British government has not been particularly enthusiastic or cooperative. So in a sense, I think it's really it's Britain which is setting the pace on this, and also deeply risk-averse Commonwealth Secretariat.
One question dealing with the documents and with the terms of history writing. I mean, if now those documents are given back or open to public, will this change the story that has been told before?
No. I think there is an issue of restitution and issue of justice. This is not going to change the terms of the historical debate hugely. And I think there's been a misconception here. A few years ago, 3 years ago, Ian Cobain, the Guardian journalist, wrote a book called The History Thieves, which focuses in large part on that issue of the so-called migrated archives, which were revealed to exist in 2013. And it's the sort of story that the press loves. You know, this hidden cache, this treasury of secret documents, which is going to change the way we think about history. It's like, you know, it's the old sort of Archduke Ferdinand found alive World War I a mistake sort of idea. And in fact, that really hasn't happened. I mean, what you have is a lot of thick description of things, of abuses in many cases that we already knew were happening. And in a way, you could turn this on its head, given how the ridiculously trivial things that are retained from view in the British National Archives. The fact that in the 1980s, the British government were happy to release hundreds of files, many of them dealing with the most atrocious abuses of human rights in Kenya, perhaps suggests at the time that the British government didn't think that was a particularly sensitive thing. So I don't think it's going to... I think the idea of historians having been somehow brainwashed by this sanitized history supermarket in which the best goods were sort of hidden behind the counter is not particularly true. We all knew that you had to work around censorship. But it was a terrible scandal and a terrible mistake from the point of view of the National Archives, the Foreign Office, not to have been open about what they held, but what they had.
Mm-hmm. And I won't stick to the brainwashing point, but but still, Mr. Shikwati, is there anything thinkable of shared history? Since Professor Achebe mentioned the terms of African history writing might differ from what has been interpreting the sources before, and what I think should be, the best thing to do is to find a common way of shared history. Would that be an option from African terms or even other terms?
Well, the use of the term shared history presupposes that we have shared interest, you know? Mm-hmm. But if the interests are not shared, I don't think you can start talking about shared history. But the good news about history is that, you know, it's made by human beings. And therefore, human beings, again, can be the ones to sit down and say, okay, let's make this to be a shared history. But having said that, I think I go back to what Achebe has pointed out, that when you observe what's going on in Africa, and I think quite a number of historians and authors have really articulated this quite well, you notice a sense of silences, meaning, as you pointed out about the documents, the Africans know something happened, but they're not talking about it. And on the Western side, they know something happened, but they feel that Africans have short memory. Therefore, they cannot remember. So you see, with this kind of disconnect, it becomes difficult to even start talking about shared history, because one side knows something terrible happened, but you seem to be glossing over that. And especially when Western countries then assume a high moral ground, you know, to start pointing to African countries that you need to have these types of values, okay? But again, if you read quite a number of books, they always seem to be the general thread that the victor, of course, determines the kind of history. And the victor can be a very violent victor, but still will push their history down the throat of those who are losing. I think probably if I was to rephrase the question, the point would be Africa being a neighbor to Europe. Geographically, Europe cannot run away from Africa. And also geographically, Africans cannot run away from Europe. So geography forces us to have dialogue, whether we like it or not. And this dialogue can be multifaceted. I think it will be a good idea, of course, to have some conversation about the past so that it helps us to situate our connections for the present. And in this case, if I'm looking at aspects of development and trade and commerce, to ask ourselves how come our 200 plus years of relationship has not enabled Africa to be a big actor globally, because I mean, you're looking at 1.2 billion people, And then I would also look at it from the point of view that our relationship with Europe created these nation-state projects. You know, you just talked about Kenya, but then if we are looking at it from a historical perspective, Kenya is just a European project, or Uganda is a European project. It's a construct of Europe. So the question would be, if we want this to be shared history, can we afford Africans the opportunity to say, we create our project, and then we present it to ourselves as Africans, and also to Europeans. And I think the momentum of where the world is headed, I think we are looking at another possibility, you know, of other actors, especially from Asia, who are going to somehow remodel the European project in Africa. And so maybe to just sum up, the point I'll put on the table is for Africans to have the agency to participate in this remodeling of what is unfolding. Otherwise, then we go back to the same trap that a new actor draws a new project, and again we start complaining about what happened to Africa.
Well, you have been talking or looking into the future on a very equal base, and I'm sorry I didn't mention before, I'm going to address Frau Leendertse in German, so if you want to, you probably have to use your headphones. Frau Leendertse, wir haben über unterschiedliche Wahrnehmungen in der...
We just talked about different perceptions of history and the writing of history. And with a certain degree of amazement, I read in the Africa policy guidelines of the federal government of Germany that were published in March this year, that when we talk about knowing African history, knowing African culture, it is now necessary to make African topics more visible. I was amazed because I thought, why does that come so late? And this is the question I'd like to ask you. Well, I think you really hit the mark. When we talk about the past, the future, dialogue on an equal footing as partners, I think that shaping the future and shaping our dialogue and relations is not possible if we do not come to terms with our history. And I think here in Germany we do have our specific experience. And here I speak, of course, on behalf of the Foreign Office of Germany, and the guidelines you've quoted are Africa policy guidelines. And I think without a dialogue about how our history developed, we are not going to make progress coming to terms with our responsibility, colonial responsibility in Germany. The guidelines also relate to our coalition agreement between the parties forming the government. We are supposed to support projects, ideas that deal with the past. That is to say, we would like to come to terms with the German colonial past, and also we would like to support cooperation projects with museums. There are several examples I could quote. And why does it come so late? Well, I can't really answer that question. We did research for this panel here at the Körber Foundation today, and we saw there's the Benar dialogue, a dialogue we've been having for quite some time. And it's a dialogue on cultural issues relating to today's Nigeria. But that was really a trailblazer project in a way, because as far as I can see, there is a dialogue about this only fairly recently. Of course, we have to make sure we do not have this debate only inside Germany, trying to define our past As the Foreign Office, I really have to say we need to see that and do that in the context of our African policy. And we need to have this dialogue together with our partners. It doesn't make sense just to have an inner German debate and be it an honest one, but we have to do that in partnership with African colleagues. And of course, it all depends on which country we're talking about. There are different approaches to these issues in the individual countries, and that dialogue should not only be had on the level of the government, but also with the civil societies. And we've just issued a declaration regarding that, and that, of course, is a very complex issue. Why it comes so late, I don't know.
Leendertse mentioned responsibility. Responsibility for the past and understanding of the past. So when we talk about responsibility, in a way, I'm into morality. I'm into, from my point of view. So Professor Murphy, one is the sources, one is the history writing, but now we're in terms of moral and ethical discussions, right?
Yeah. I mean, you might think that this discussion is kind of some way from where we started this conference in 1989. But listening to the minister, it brought back a memory of my first visit to Berlin in 1988. I was staying with a student friend who was working on the West German Communist Party and was staying in Berlin. We crossed the wall, went to Friedrichstrasse, wandered around the center of East Berlin, and went into a few bookshops. And one of the things that I remember very clearly, because I was working on African history already, was that there were a fairly large number of books on the history of Germany in Africa. It was clearly a kind of a safe area for East German historians to attack, German imperialism.
Okay.
And so it's a sort of reminder that, this is a very politicized history, and people come at it often for, particular contemporary political reasons. And the problem, again, sort of thinking about the sort of the end of the Cold War, which is in a sense a sort of, for many people, led to a kind of a loss of faith in the idea of Marxism, of progress, of that sort of basis for a radical politics. And it's been replaced in a way by, certainly, the British-American left, by kind of intersectionality, an idea that you forge an alliance of oppressed peoples. And so empire comes back into the scene. I mean, when I started writing about empire in my doctoral thesis in '87, it felt like a very marginal area of history. Now, increasingly, and quite rightly so, it's been integrated more and more into the sort of the national history of Britain. But it's also become deeply politicized. And if you think about, so that and I think that goes along with perhaps a kind of a loss of religious faith in Western society. We think, what is the basis for moral action? And one of the bases now is the idea of restitution of historical wrongs. And I think those two elements come together, so that the history of imperialism is now extremely important for the British left. And whatever the British government is or isn't doing, if you read the British newspapers, either the left or the right-wing newspapers, the history of British imperialism has been incorporated in these contemporary culture wars, which are raging fiercely in the wake of the Brexit debate.
Mr. Shikwati, you mentioned, or you made a very strong plaidoyer for equality in dialogues, for equality in defining future projects. Still, I would like, I don't always want to look back, but still I would like to know the perception, the perception of the question of morality. What does Europe owe Africa? Is this a discussion?
I think if we could just start with Berlin. I mean, when you visit Berlin, there are so many museums that show Berlin's interaction with the rest of the world, good or bad. But then it's not easy to get the museum that talks about the hotel where African partition took place. And you know, this was an iconic event that turned around the face of Africa. So you notice that there's that deliberate erasure of history, because Berlin has a central part in Africa's history on the basis of the powers that were then at play, drew the map of the nation states, as I call them, projects of Europe. All those projects were designed from here. So one would expect some recognition that this city played a critical role. And you know what makes it even worse is when you go to African countries and you visit the museums, again, there'll be more about Europe and less about Africa. So again, that's why in my mind, I see Europe as what maybe historians or political scientists would call the deep state in Africa, which means the shadow governments that we never see, that really articulate policies, design activities in Africa, but then position African leaders as though they're the ones in charge, when in essence, the deep state, which is Europe, you know, is driving the agenda. In Kenya, we have a term for it. We call it the old money. You know, there's always the new money, the new rich boy around, or rich girl around the corner, and then there's always the old money. The old money has deeper roots than the new money. So if we have to really reach a level where we are keen to look for the future, I think I go back to my point. The most common denominator has to be interest. So we have to start looking at, okay, let's not beg Europe to position Africa in any way. Let us look at how we can look at what are the European interests, what are the African interests, and then the convergent point. Because if we don't take the path of interest, we take the path of pity. And then with the pity, you know, pity sort of, it doesn't give you obligation. You know, nobody can tell you you must feel pity against James or for James or something. It's something that comes from your heart. But with the interest and obligation, meaning you give me this, I give you that. If you don't give me this, then you don't get that. I think that's the kind of articulation we should be looking at. And for me, I would say, well, Europe has demonstrated a rich history in technological advancement, in how they organize society, and Africa on its part is rich with natural resources, rich in culture that is untapped. And then what would be the best connector? If you are rich in technological advancement, it means you are looking for market. So if you're looking for market, then let our connection not be about pity. You know, pitch your solution to us. Okay, we might not afford, but you'll give us the aspiration to work hard to get the amounts of money to afford. Just the way if you like a Mercedes car, you work hard, maybe take a loan or do more business for you to be able to afford that kind of car. So Africa has the resources. But then I think this pity relationship that Europe deliberately pushes down the throat of Africans. You know, you're not ready, you just need to be helped. But then the same Europe goes to Asia, they say, we are ready to do business with you guys, you know. I think that we need to reorient it. And then, of course, draw from the past without necessarily having to shed a lot of tears and forget about the future and create that possibility. So in conclusion, in my view, the world is changing, and whether Europe likes it or not, its obsession with the past is going to be deleted because other actors care less. Let's say China, when it comes to Africa, is not thinking about Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. They're thinking about Africa. Europe, even in your presentation, you were talking about depends on which country. But you see, this is a European project That's why Europe is obsessed with which country. Is it English-speaking, French-speaking? Where the world is moving, as far as Africa is concerned, it's not about which country anymore. It's about Africa, that commonality. And you can see already momentum, even within Africa itself, looking for possibilities for free trade area, more movement, one passport for the whole continent, and appreciation of cultures from different parts. So for me, I think the future means Europe must take the courage to reject the idea of, living in the past. The past was always good because the empire will always remember its past, right? Because I understand there's a time in this part of Europe, religion was reigning supreme, right? There's a time churches would be religious leaders, bishop, popes.
It differs from country to country, actually.
Yeah. But basically what I'm driving at is if you really harp so much on your past glorious time, the new actors will just sweep you off your feet. And before you know it, you'll have to be converted into some kind of relic that needs donations. Yeah.
Actually, if I got you right, the regulatory principle you mention or you drive at is the market.
Interest.
Yeah, you start out with interest
Interest is
but
the
then
core.
you have the trade, right?
Yeah, trade, of course, because exchange of goods makes people meet eye to eye. When you go to the shop to buy bread, you're not trying to beg the shopkeeper, and the shopkeeper is not begging you for. You see, that's the interest, the converging point. But then if you sit on the street and you put your hands out, that's a different kind of,
Definitely.
articulation of how you want your interest addressed, So I think for Africa, it's about let's exchange and let's not really put the idea of pity to be the anchor point of how Africa connects with Europe.
So it's not a connection between helping Africa, but being interested in Africa. Frau Leendertse, wir stehen vor...
Mrs. Leendertse, we have global policy challenges regarding the organization of trade, how to overcome poverty and hunger. And we've seen Africa is interested, and of course there's also an interest on the part of Europe. Who is going to set the agenda? I'd like to just come back to what James said. Of course, it's very important. The future must be interest-driven and not just depending on whether you can remember and come to terms with your history. But still, I think you can learn from history. And you have addressed this yourself. You've said today we have neocolonial tendencies. And those neocolonial tendencies are also focused on resources. They are also interest-driven. And maybe we should develop a counter-project. But let's come back to our question of multilateralism. Multilateralism is the answer. I know personally, and also the Foreign Office and the federal government of Germany can say, without the Africans, we cannot be successful globally on the level of the United Nations. We can no longer implement our interests without Africa. Let me give a couple of examples. 4 agreements and treaties that were ratified because the African group with its 54 votes has agreed in favor. Without the Africans, it would not have been possible to sign the arms trade treaty. It would have not have been possible without the Africans to implement women's rights without the support of the Africans. That is to say, maybe you would not have expected that answer, but let me say that one interest of being in alliance with the Africans, one interest that we as Europeans strongly have, is to set the global agenda. And the Africans, for us, and here we think of Africa in general as a group, and your self-organization within the African Union and the regional organizations, it is quite clear that we have you as an ally that behaves differently than the US at the moment, Russia and China. The Africans are interested also in a multilateral approach to solve our global policy issues. This is interest-driven, and we in the European Union try to be in touch with the African Union, and that's interest-driven because we would like to shape the global agenda together. Let's talk about trade. It was a week or 2 weeks ago when the 22nd country joined the African Free Trade Zone. I think Zimbabwe and Sierra Leone, they still need a ratification in Parliament, but as of June or July, it will be possible to go to all the 22 countries, and the overall goal is to have all 52 entities, and then we will negotiate with Africa, with all the states about trade. Of course, the negotiating power, that is something we are discussing. Now, if the Africans really get together and join and approach the EU collectively, then they can defend their interests in a much better way. Trade is one important sphere. And of course, we as Europeans are interested in the market, but not only that, we are also interested in stability. So for us, the question is, what is Africa, the continent of crisis or the continent of opportunities? And here in Germany and in Europe, the discussion has changed very much. And also development cooperation has changed. We don't do it out of pity. We develop structures of development cooperation because we are interested in stability. And we are also interested in maintaining contacts with Africa as a trading partner. So what you have been demanding is really already our government policy one-to-one. Now, let's move away from government policies for a moment.
The equality and the interest of each other. But still, there was this one term of deep state. And Frau Leendertse has also made a point of neocolonialism. You divide African history into pre-colonial history, colonial history, and past colonial times. So how consistent is the deep state or the colonial mindset in our days?
Even those terms, pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial, is looking at Africa from the outside, right? Those have been defined for us by Europe. Could we for a moment consider how do Africans conceptualize their own worlds? And this is where I disagree with you. History is extremely important. You know, a lot of the things that we're dealing with today have its roots in history. When you talk about equality, between Africa and the rest of the world in Europe. There was equality between Africa and Europe, right? We don't remember, before the era of the Atlantic slave trade, Africans and Europe were equal. There was that feeling that Africans were equal to Europeans. It's just that Africans look different. So it is the epoch of the Atlantic slave trade, actually the international slave trades, the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, and the trans-Saharan slave trade that brought in this whole idea of Africans as being less than Europeans. Before that, you talk about trade. We had trade. If you go back to the 1300s, you had King Mansa Musa taking that famous pilgrimage to Mecca. He took so much gold to Mecca that currency became devaluated as far as Europe. So Europe knew that Africans and Africa was a place for economic activity which they could embark on with their equals. What changed that is the era of the international slave trades. And this is when you go back to the writing of history. I'm a historian. Whose history? I asked that question. Whose history are we talking about? When you look at archives, who creates the archives? It's the Europeans that create the archives. So this written archive that we're looking at is told from a European point of view. What is the archive? I am an oral historian. There's a reason why I like to talk with Africans and get their own point of view of their own history and not let others define their history for them. And so if you look at the African point of view, I talked about, first of all, you won't have pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial, right? The Europeans came to Africa solely because of trade. It was all about economics. When the slave trades ceased to no longer become economically viable, Europe was looking for a new relationship with Africa. That relationship with Africa that they were looking for they wanted the African middleman to stay in Africa because of all of these resources that they knew that Africans had. So you remove the middleman from the equation so that Europe could deal directly with Africans. That's in essence what led to the scramble for Africa, right? And the eventual colonization. And so when you think about colonization in Africa, it was an extremely extractive relationship. You know, don't let anyone tell you that Europeans or Europe came to Africa to develop Africa. No, Europe didn't. I don't care if you're talking about the French, the English, the Germans. None of these European colonialists came to Africa to develop. It was about extracting. They had 3 cardinal principles: to encourage the production of cash crops. These are crops that Africans did not eat themselves. You're talking about cotton. You go to Mozambique, and Mozambicans and Tanganyikans talk about cotton being the mother of poverty. You go to Congo, and Africans are forced to collect rubber. The Africans didn't eat any of these things. So this led to, you're doing all of this to the detriment of our sustenance crops. So it's all about extracting, right? So you have cash cropping. You have encouraging Africans to buy the goods that have been produced from African cash crops. But Europe even went further to say, not only do you buy these goods, they created what they call the Colonial Pact, which meant that if you were in a British colony like Nigeria, my birthplace was, Nigerians had to deal with Britain even if it would be cheaper to deal with France or Germany or Portugal. That was the Colonial Pact, right? So there are many, many levels of this extraction, from the introduction of European currencies to the introduction of railroads. You know, you talk about railroads, people think, oh yeah, Europeans came to develop Africa. No, railroads connected areas of production to the coast. It wasn't about connecting African communities from one community to the next. So again, I mean, I can go on and on. The issue is, whose history are we talking about? Right? When you look at the colonial period, when I talk about whose history, talked about Belgium, Berlin, where we are, in Germany. You know, whether these histories have been forgotten or people have chosen not to talk about these histories. You know, when you look at Germany in Africa, for instance, let's start with Germany. I mean, there's a lot of blame to go around, but, let's talk about Germany. It was all about opportunity from the very beginning, right? So Germans come into Africa. Nobody is talking about the atrocities that were committed in German East Africa, in German Southwest Africa. In fact, we know that the methods that were used during the Holocaust were practiced on the Nama and the Herero. Nobody's talking about that. 80% of the Nama, of the Herero population was entirely wiped out by the Germans in Africa. 50% of the Nama population was wiped out by the Germans. If you look at Rwanda and Burundi, a lot of the issues that we have today go back to the colonial past. And Germany was in the middle of it. Not only was Germany there, Belgium was there as well. So this difference between the Hutus and the Tutsis was not something that was there before the Europeans came in. So again, when we look at today and we're looking at neocolonialism, a lot of it has to do with our relationship, Africa's relationship with our colonial masters. That the relationship has been ordered from outside Africa. And so when you're talking about equality in a relationship, Europe should not be defining for Africa what the next step should be. Really shouldn't. These conversations should be had in Africa with Africans having a seat at the table. So Europe needs to start listening and not prescribing. I'll give you one example. Several years ago on American university campuses, you had students trying to do good. They were walking around campus without any shoes. What were they doing? They were going to donate their slippers and other shoes to Africa and the so-called developing world. Not knowing, like I say to my students, good intentions are not enough. So you decide to do this. Did you talk with Africans to find out whether they need your hand-me-downs? No, they don't. Because pushing those hand-me-downs, whether it's the shoes or second-hand clothing, what are you doing? You're displacing African traders. You're displacing African women who are the cobblers of shoes, the seamstresses and all of that, because you're bringing in these cheap goods. So again, I know I sort of went back to talk about history. We can't forget the importance of history and whose stories that we are telling. If we're going to talk about moving forward in a respectful manner, then Africa has to dictate which manner that relationship takes. So it's not Europe dictating for Africa. And what comes to mind there is that pity. It can't be that. It has to be true partners. And for that to happen, Africans have to be part of this conversation, not being dictated to.
I recognize that you looked at me because I had this feeling that you wanted to comment, or...
Well, I agree with much of that. I just make 2 points. One is a very narrow historical one, and the other may be a broader one about the impact of colonialism. The narrow historical one is who writes the history. Okay, that's fine. It's mostly, most of the work being produced is happening in Western universities. But that is, I'm afraid, history is an art form, and art thrives where there's money. It's as simple as that. And you sort of talk about, doing oral history. Oral history is not a cheap form of history. As someone who's put together a few oral history grant bids in their time, to do it properly, you need proper recording, archival facilities. You need sort of, you need manpower to transcribe, to preserve, before you've even started to write it up. So, there won't be a great deal of African history produced in Africa until the African states are more prosperous. So that's, take it from there. What are the problems in Africa? You look at the way that colonialism impacted on different parts of the world, and it impacts in very different ways and has very different sorts of legacies. And some areas, some cultures seem to be more able, not necessarily to resist it, but to a kind of resilience, which enables a state like India now to be, moving forward into being one of the great superpowers of the 21st century and beyond. Africa was always particularly vulnerable. You think about, James mentioned the Congress of Berlin, how quickly, once you had the medical technology to resist disease and the transport technology to penetrate the interior, how quickly Africa fell to colonialism. You had this moment of intense optimism in the early 60s that is all going to be washed away, that soon that, and in a way it was what impelled the Commonwealth into a new phase of its existence. It was the sense that soon we will all be dealing on equal terms. There will be massive and rapid development. We're all moving into the sort of sunlit uplands. And it didn't happen. And again, you sort of talk about that Cold War movement. In the 80s, the West was already tightening the screws over debt. With the end of the Cold War, African states lose the little room for maneuver they have to trade one side in the Cold War off against another to enhance their bargaining position. They particularly, you're back into a period of intense vulnerability to outside penetration. And now it's not just the old West, the old imperial powers. As James said, the big story in Africa at the moment is China, who have a completely different attitude and a very hard-nosed attitude to engagement in Africa. And, yes, the solutions have to come from Africa, but I would suggest they have to come from a more joined-up Pan-African. There's got to be a rediscovery of that Pan-Africanist dream that figures like Nkrumah promoted and Nyerere in the 60s. The African Union has got to be more effective. It's got to provide the sort of voice that CARICOM now provides for Caribbean territories. You've got to soup up. ECOWAS proved itself. It may be slightly controversial, but it sorted out the Gambia on its own terms very quickly in a military operation in the way that would have caused howls of protest across the world if some Commonwealth force had tried to do it. Mm-hmm. So that's, the regional organizations, the Pan-African organizations have got to provide a better they've got to be better at bargaining for Africa as a whole.
Mr. Shikwati, I think speaking of Pan-Africanism, you always, and you already made it clear on this panel also, you always speak in favor of empowering Africa by Africans themselves and putting money and enabling development projects into infrastructure. In terms of developing the infrastructure and the Pan-Africanism, So is that the entrance into the post-colonial times?
Well, Achebe has just warned us not to use the word post-colonial, pre-colonial, And yeah, but for me, I think I recognize the importance of what I refer to as the economic muscle.
The economic, sorry?
Economic muscle,
Okay.
when you're doing weightlifting. So all the things my sister is describing, the element that is so critical to make them happen, even to get the Africans on the table. Look at how Chinese are now on the table in global affairs. They have not begged. The economic muscle has made the world to say, hey, we have to listen to the Chinese, right? The Chinese are not democratic. Maybe they don't follow the human rights ethos of the West, but the West now sits with them. So I think Africa is coming from a point of view where maybe we relied so much on what the West was teaching us on how to interpret how the world works. So that in itself is a dangerous approach. And for me, what history is revealing from the conversation we're having now is that the world is sort of a game, people playing games, if we used a game as an example. So if it's soccer, you can't just get in and win unless you've got some idea about the rules of the game. And then you have then to develop strategy and tactics and stuff like that. So I think Africa now is in a position where, based on history and the new actors coming on the stage, where it can see the unraveling reality that the world is all about games, right? But what's critical in this game is what I refer to as the economic muscle. And the economic muscle means one has to be productive and has to have the value that the market recognizes. So you notice China, despite the repulsive aspect of how they run their politics, but their products are all over, made in China. So what we simply need as Africa is to look at how to leverage with our neighbors, the Europeans, and maybe the upcoming economic powers from Asia, to grow the economic muscle. And the economic muscle is never handed down to anybody for free, because even in business, if you're running a successful hotel business, you don't want a neighbor to come and put a hotel next to you and then take away your business. So I think with that recognition that, in my view, the world will never be fair to anybody, you have just to learn how to play the game. Now, to your question about maybe the issues of trade and infrastructure, I agree that obviously the extractive interest will always override the other side that has the challenge of maybe financing their types of infrastructure. But the good news is the tools coming from the successful economies afford us some leeway. And I'm talking about digitalization. I want just to come from the point of view that when you talk to many European companies, investors, banks, they'll always tell you there's nothing in Africa that we can invest in, right? And if anything, they'll refer us to GIZ. Please just go to GIZ. Africa, you're not for business. But if you look at what digitalization, which is a tool for the West, very successful, there's a way Africans can tweak it in their favor, and then use it to recognize their capital, because part of what makes people in developed countries feel Africa is poor is because they feel they can't see the capital. Africa can recognize its own capital using these kinds of tools for digitalization. And then with this opening up of intra-Africa connectivity, we can ride on Africans that have already seen the importance of Pan-Africanism. And here I'm looking, there's a Nigerian, for example, called Tony Elumelu, right? Who's been driving the African entrepreneurship platform, recognizing as many entrepreneurs as possible. And I think he must be having an alumni of over maybe 3,000 by now. So that's one part. But there's this other part. Once you have the entrepreneurs, they need innovative tools. And these innovative tools then have to be well thought out so that they can compete at the marketplace in Europe, in China, and Asia. So by looking at the future, I'm not erasing the past. What I know is once Africa gains the economic muscle, it can even buy a piece of land here in Berlin and erect a museum and lobby hard and pay lobbyists to lobby your government to make sure that there's a museum that recognizes something like that. The same for the archives. But in the absence of the economic muscle, then you go back again to the same colonial force to beg, please help me put up a museum. And if you ask them, they'll tell you must follow this kind of rules, never insult Berlin, make sure you say Berlin is a good place, So for me, I think in terms of looking at the future, we shouldn't erase the history. We should simply ask ourselves, how do countries deal with what we call deep state? How do you disrupt deep state anywhere in the world, even in the US? Those tactics that societies use to disrupt deep state is the same tactics then Africa has to deploy, and there are quite a number of them. You could deploy several other actors to dilute the existing deep state, or literally come up with a new style of operation. And I think for Africa, we have this possibility, I just want to underline this, that the digitalization space gives us a possibility, given the fact that the majority of our population are young people, and young people like playing with gadgets. Europe has the tech, but then their population is getting older. So we are the guys who will actually pick this tech and then tweak it and play around with it. But that's really on the rosy side. What I want to avoid is now, maybe from my sister, is creating a possibility that maybe people can vote about this. Maybe that's what you're talking about, multilateralism. I appreciate it, but I still have doubts about it because there has to be the muscle to implement the kind of treaty you're signing. So even if 54 countries support the multilateralism and US overrules it, and it can stamp its authority and say, forget what you signed, it's going to be overruled. But if we grow the economic muscle of these 54 countries, so that when you're signing this treaty, somebody knows it's backed by the possibility that the guys who have voted for it can also put the dime to make sure it works, or put the euro or the shilling or the dollar or whatever it is. So I think when you're looking at history, really, I think for me the missing point is the trick of how countries grow their economic muscle, which we need to possibly drive it as Africans and then align it probably to our historical context.
Before we open up, I'd like to ask one last question to you, Professor Achebe. Speaking about the economic muscle and quoting Mr. Shikwati about playing the game and knowing the rules. Would these be the rules also coming out of Africa, or is it again rules being placed by economic partners, non-African origins?
I was listening and I do agree a lot with, James, what you have articulated, but again, I go back to how can we be economic powerhouses? You talked about the 60s being this period of such expectation for Africa, right? But how could it have been a period of expectation for Africa when you look at the European policies? Africa was never equipped to rule themselves. Look at a country like Congo, right? The Belgians came in and they practiced an administrative policy of paternalism, which the Germans also practiced, which essentially meant that Africans were children. And as children, you can't task their limited minds. So much so that Africans were entirely removed from the governance systems and structures. How many Africans by independence in 1960 in a country of 15 million had gone to secondary school? 136 by independence. 16 of 15 million people had gone to university first degree. In Patrice Lumumba and Joseph Kasavubu's government, only 3 members of the government had university degrees. So how do we engage with Europe on equal terms? Or you take the example of Guinea. When Guinea voted no for having the French, telling the French, we don't want you to stay, what did the French do? They took everything. They left, taking even paper clips. It was the independent country of Ghana that came to Guinea's aid. Okay, so how can you become economically viable when we have not, in terms of education, in terms of, Ngugi wa Thiong'o calls it a colonialism of the mind. My father calls it a crisis of the soul. We were taught as Africans that we were less than, that we are less than Europeans. We aspire to become European. In the French colonial policy, it was becoming petit français or évoilés or French citizens. In the British, it was little Englishmen, right? So we aspire to be European. We're taught that everything that we are is wrong. How do you get out of it? Yes, colonialism has fallen, right? We're so-called independent states, but we're still dealing with the psychology of colonialism. Our minds are still colonized. And this is why we talk about a decolonization of our educational structure and educational system. Until we get there, we cannot deal with Europeans on equal terms. It's as simple as that. We're still sort of stuck in the colonial era.
You talk to the average, African, they're talking about, oh, I'm French first before I'm African. I mean, where does that nonsense come from? So again, it's going to take much more. It's a re-education of our mindset to realize that what is African is in fact positive. Patrice Lumumba called it positive neutralism. Okay? And I do agree with this whole idea of Africa can only be a semi-equal foe to Europe if we come together. I mean, Kwame Nkrumah talked about it in terms of his principles of neocolonialism. That the only way to deal with Europe on a semi-equal basis is for Africans to come together and speak with one tongue. But it's very difficult to do that because you're talking about nations of over 3,000 different nations of people that speak different languages and have different cultures. My country, Nigeria, has 512 different ethnic groups, nations of people that speak different languages. When the Europeans divided Africa, they didn't divide it with any regard to familial space. So you have sometimes relatives in Ghana and some other relatives in Togo. Togo speaks French, Ghana speaks English. What kind of sense does that make? Okay, so I think that if the answer were easy, I don't think we'll be in the mess that we're in right now. So it's not an easy answer. But, I always say we can't lose sight of why we are at the point that we are. So it's one thing to say, yes, we've got to be economically solid and all of that. There are reasons why we're not. And if you look at the way that society interacted or engaged before this period, you find that, for instance, take African women. You talked about women. I like to say that the European women's movement, feminist movement, is not the African women's feminist movement. We don't have to fight for equality in pay because we're paid the same thing. It doesn't mean that African women don't have things to fight for, but what we're fighting for is very different from what European women are fighting for. We're fighting for, have school fees been raised? Because it's the women that are paying for it. Is there running water? And, our white feminists, Caucasian feminists, look at it and say, is that actually a feminist agenda? And African women will say, yes, it is. It is feminist because it really sort of involves us, and we are in the forefront of that. And so I give these examples to show that, how different the conversation can be with an equality of status, where you have people actually sitting together and Europe actually listening and hearing Africa speak. That's the very beginning. But I don't think there's not an easy answer to this. Africa is young in terms of being a democracy. If my father could say that Nigeria was his little sister, African democracies are extremely young. And, I'm not trying to, there's a lot of blame that can be cast with our dictators and all of that. That's not what I'm talking about. It's just that it will take us some time to get to where we need to get to. And our colonial past, unfortunately, hasn't helped, us in this desire to get to where we need to get to.
I guess, thank you. Actually, nobody expected easy answers. Now is the chance to ask some more questions. There are 2 microphones on the floor. Please go to the microphones and give a short... Oh, you walk around? Okay, so it's different from yesterday? Okay, so please raise your hand and introduce yourself, and then we have like 20 minutes for questions. You can either speak German or English, that's fine.
Okay, yeah, my name is Hans Christian Jasch. I have a question going back to the question if history matters. Does China have a comparative advantage due to not having a colonial history with Africa? And does the potentially neo-colonialist agenda China has, and I mean, if you look at Chinese infrastructure projects in Africa, they don't differ so much from the Belgians building railways to Katanga in order to transport copper to the shores. But isn't this also often a rather comfortable argument because China is not asking for democratic accountability, it's not asking questions on human rights. So I think we are at the very difficult point there sometimes where this anti-colonialist discourse is, maybe you're right that it's just the economy which matters, but I wonder what the nexus, I would be really interested in your opinion on these issues.
I guess it's the first answer goes to you.
Okay, so maybe you misunderstood me. I didn't mean that history doesn't matter. What I simply said is, the economic muscle is so critical, even to bring history to life. And that's why even in Europe, you are able to dig some thousands of years of history and bring it to life and celebrate it, and sometimes even paint people who did worse stuff, but you recreate them and have them look nice, right? So history is very important, and I agree with my sister Achebe there. Basically, the point I'm looking at is this is a game, and it keeps shifting. So if you're an African and you can see the horizon of what's unfolding, you have the history, yes, and you can see what's unfolding, things are changing. I mean, I just gave the example of digitalization. Digitalization, the way it works, Facebook has captured literally everybody, whichever language they speak, they have become one nation in Facebook, correct? So for me, 3,000 is not a big challenge, because if Facebook can capture the entire globe and have it talking, and somebody can analyze and know what you want to buy, what time you're sleeping, you can imagine that's a new frontier that even as we talk about Europe and Africa, digitalization is creating a totally new playing field, which offers both a big threat again and an opportunity. And because I'm interested in the economic muscle, I'm investing more on the opportunity side, And for me, I see this as an area that can make even the 3,000 nations that we have in Africa to be able to work together, because we've just seen how the digital platform has made the world to find itself talking about the same thing. But now on the China side, comparative advantage, yes, to some extent, because as I said, they will not be talking about Kenya being English-speaking or French-speaking.
Ghana, French.
Yeah. They look at Africa as Africa. And so they engage Africa as one, and then after that, Africans can pick which areas fit them. So that gives them the comparative advantage. But in terms of what next, because if you look at the Chinese model, it's a model where the government has the central authority. Actually, some analysts say China is a civilization state, so civilization for China is the central authority that commands the rest. There's a possibility that they too will reach a stage and say, we think our model is better than the one you've been using with the Europeans. And again, if you listen to many African heads of states, they seem to say, well, we don't want to retire from power because we've seen that when you're in power longer, you develop the country, which I don't know if it's true or not. Or authoritarianism. We've seen Ethiopia being cited as a good example, Rwanda being cited as a good example, as where authority means development, okay? So I wouldn't say they have 100% comparative advantage, but they simply, by them knocking the door of Africa, they have offered Africans just a window of opportunity to see that there are other possibilities. So if Africans grasp that aspect, I think we can really leverage on this and create our own agenda and put our story. But it's just a window of opportunity. I say this because from East Africa, we have a history. We had the Omani Arabs colonizing the East Coast before even the British came. And then, of course, we had the British, and now we are saying we've got the Chinese. And every time, there's always the sense that the new one is better than the old one, But then, once you start swimming into the largesse of the new one, you start saying maybe the old was better, okay? So the best, I think, is for us to go back to history and look at how we've related with the powers before. Because it's not just Europe that was the first one to interact with us. And then ask ourselves, why are we always on the losing side of the game. Because a good coach has to do this, right? And say, well, maybe we need to go for more training and stuff like that. So I think because the new power is coming in, there's some kind of fresh air a little bit. But we have to think through it, otherwise then we fall in the same trap again of complaining about the Chinese when they finally settle.
Okay, I think there are at least 3 more questions, so 4, 5. So we have to shorten our answers, and after those 5 questions, I think we run out of time. So you had one there, otherwise it's Herr van Masha? Okay, in the back, I guess, sorry.
Hello, Alina Mongiu-Propidi from Hertie School of Governance. I was very interested in this discussion about new money, old money. And I wanted to ask you if you think that, for instance, all the conditionalities related to good governance in the European development aid, such as the ones in the Cotonou Agreement or related to budget aid, do you consider those also fairly neocolonial? And if we remove them, what else is there to help improvement towards good governance? Because if we look at figures, you see there is growth. Ivory Coast in the past 10 years, they grew a lot, but as growth was higher, actually open contracting went down and inequality rose. So fully understanding your Samaritan dilemma example with the sleepers, is this also an example of Samaritan dilemma? The West should not do good governance conditionality, and then who should do it? Where would this come from? Thank you.
Okay, who should be answering your questions? I don't. Okay. You want me to bundle the questions and then in back? Okay. So if it's right there.
Thanks very much, Jörn Graving, German Development Institute. And just like to follow up to what Alina just was asking. The quick version is support to democracy from Western governments or non-governmental organizations, international organizations. Is that part of the problem or part of the solution?
Herr van Marschall, ist Ihre Frage in die Richtung?
Mr. van Marschall, does your question go the same way? No.
A humble request to Professor Achebe, because when you talked about what is talked about with the Herreros, nobody talks about the Herreros. I don't recognize my country. I mean, if you would have said that 10 or 20 years ago, I could agree. But if I would go to the archives of my newspaper and would look what is written in German newspapers about the relationship with Southwest Africa, the majority would be about the Herreros, about our discussions, what has been done, whether we need to recompensate. There have been historical commissions and so on and so on. So there's no lock about, when you go back to your students, please don't tell them in Germany nobody is talking about the Herreros. It's the contrary. It's the contrary. We have soul-searching discussions about renaming streets in Berlin, which are where the names are in connection with German colonial rule. And so if I have a lack of understanding or knowledge, for example, it is not about what the West or the colonial powers have done to Africa, including the slave trade. We have museums about that. I have lots of knowledge about that. Whereas a lack of knowledge, what is still a black box, and I'm not selling that to turn the accusation around. It's really I'm interested. I would like to understand much better the cooperation, the interaction between African tribes and nations in this context, whether it's cooperation, whether it's collaboration, and how you deal with that. And that would be the way how you retake the interpretation of your history, not only describing, from my point of view, Africans as victims, but in a certain way of being actors, not under the same terms, of course, during colonialism, but understanding your people as actors, as subjects, and not only objects of history. That would help me to understand a little bit better what was going on. Yeah, that was a request concerning what you are teaching to your students and how you would react to this understanding, not talking only about victimization, but making your tribes a subject of history.
Okay, so then I take the last one there, and then we sort of organize the panel.
Yeah, David Priestland, historian at the University of Oxford. I think I'm a historian of communism and of more recent contemporary history, and in a way I'd like to support Professor Achebe not from the perspective of colonial history, which I'm not an expert on, but from the perspective of our history of 1989 and recent history, because I think I had the temerity, arrogance to write a history of global communism, and I realized how difficult that was. And I think we really still see, including historians of communism, still see this very much as a European story. Understandably, it was a very traumatic, difficult story. But actually the 70s and 80s, as Philip Murphy said, was very important. The Cold War was very important for the Global South more generally. And it was intertwined with anti-colonial, the end of imperialism, anti-colonial struggles, armed struggles. And the 1970s very much saw the rise of the Global South as an actor with a new international economic order, for instance. Now, that is something I think we probably don't know very much about in the public sphere. And we need to know more about. Now, actually, the rise of US power in the 1980s and 1990s may, of course, had consequences for the end of the Soviet Union, for freedom in Eastern Europe. But it also had some rather different consequences for the Global South in the terms of debt and also in terms of political leverage. So I think in a way it's things like that that and I include myself in this, one needs to think, and that's the wonderful thing about a history forum like this, relationship between history and politics. I think we need to think, when we're thinking about present attitudes of the Global South to the West, we need to remember this quite recent history, which we probably know about rather little, me included, but also the public more generally. So I think I would support Professor Achebe on this point.
Okay, thank you. There was one question there, and then we're basically going to the
Hello,
answer.
I'm Mirona Troncota. I'm a researcher from National University of Political Science in Bucharest, and I have a question for Professor Achebe. Actually, when I heard your very inspiring speech, I thought about the other great Nigerian writer, Chimamanda Adichie, and her TED talk about the dangers of a single story. And there she refers to this idea of stealing people's dignity with stories, but also restoring people's dignity with stories. And I would put that in relation to the former question regarding victimization of people in Africa. There are many writers talking about a post-traumatic syndrome in writing history of a colonial period. So my question is, and this maybe deals a bit also with the importance of feminism also in discussing history and the use of emotions, because usually we have this positivist, rationalist discussion that we need to talk about numbers and facts and everything that is observable and so on. But there is a huge importance of emotions, especially in this post-traumatic syndrome dealing with the past. So my question is, going back to your students, how to tackle discussions with students both from Africa and from Europe in a very sensitive way, using both facts and emotions. Because sometimes getting away from emotions and maybe frustrations and the feeling that you have been acted upon with injustice is normal for a while. So in which type of stage do you think at this point both professors in Europe and in Africa are we in order to deal with these emotions and study history as a science at the same time?
Okay, so thank you very much. So we have two complex, basically, three are addressed to you, Professor Achebe, in terms of finding a better understanding, knowledge, and also referring to recent history and to combining facts and emotions. That is basically one topic, I think, and the other one is more economic. Who will support democracy if the old money goes out, and where does the new money come from? Since this is basically the last round, please feel free to answer, and please be short. So, please go ahead.
I must respond to your suggestions or your comments. First of all, as an African, you cannot tell me how to teach African history. It's not possible. It's my history. And as an African, I teach African history from an African-centered perspective. It's not about victimization. Okay, Europe came to Africa. We were there before Europe came, right? And you're talking about how has, that I can't say that Herero and Nama history is not talked about. Has Germany agreed that that was the first genocide? Have you called it a genocide? It's in court now. The Nama and Herero have taken the German government to court because they want reparations. It has not been done. Yes, there have been apologies, but it goes back to whose history? I'm not saying you're not writing history, but from whose point of view is it? Will the average Nama or Herero person reading the history that you all have produced, will they see themselves in the history? Will they feel that it represents them? I think not. So again, it's about from what point of view is history being told? Which archives? Whose archives, right? Archives, European archives are there, but again, who produced the knowledge in the archives? So when I teach my students, I say, yes, sometimes we're forced to use these archives, but we have to use these archives critically. Combined with your question, I would say that as an African, teaching African history is not a feel-good history. That's what I say to my students. There were a number of extreme injustices done upon Africans. I do not teach a history of victimization. I talk about Europe in as much as Africans are interacting with Europe. My concern as an Africanist is to teach African history on its own terms. I'm not an I don't talk about imperialism. I talk about African history. And when Europe is involved, I speak about it. With regards to emotions and all of that, how can you remove humanity from history? A lot of people try to talk about the slave trade, and they talk about numbers of people, so many million people were. All of those, they're human beings behind those numbers. The average African person will actually tell you that in our tradition, we don't count human beings. You count animals. And this was one of the problems that ensued in the colonial period where Europeans were trying to tax Africans and telling us, go count your people. It ensued in a lot of different rebellions because Africans don't count people. So again, you can't remove humanity from history. And it is my job as an African-born historian to tell the history of my own people in their own terms.
Thank you. Would you like to add something to the Herero-Nama case? Probably.
Also ich denke, da hat sich in den letzten Jahren
I think of the past years, there's been some movement, and I think this week we can expect a further decision in connection with the German Historical Museum and the Pillar of the Cup calls, and so I think it's on the agenda on Thursday, so there's some movement there, and that also shows that we and I connect that with the question about good governance and the question of the development cooperation. So I think the will to discuss on equal footing. I mean, I think you can admit that there's a so it's all too Eurocentric, and of course there's a right to Africa-centric history, and our approach also has to be that to have the partners at an equal footing, both with regard. So I'll stay with my statement that without the past, you cannot bring the present in as a political foundation for a partnership approach. So you need both the past and the present for a dialogue, and the dialogue is of course a diplomatic business, and it's not just African partners, and to be aware of the fact that where the interests are of the countries we're talking to, or the Pan-African institutions we talk to, and also to be aware of the fact what history is made up of, and so there's colonial history that will of course burden this dialogue, but maybe also which indeed needs to be included. This colonial context needs to be considered in the dialogue. I mean, that is nothing else than the dialogue with so that's the tradecraft that is just a general recognition. And I mean, to come back to good governance, and maybe it's also because we believe that it's part and parcel of good governance also to look into our history. And of course we look at it from a Eurocentric view. So maybe that's why our approach is that good governance needs to be needs to play a role also in a partnership. But I think you can have a long discussion about that. So, but we need that. So we do need the muscle. I recognize the economic muscle.
Money. I guess this, would you like to add? And then we're running out of time. I'm sorry. But we still owe the answer.
I think basically I go back to the point that this is a game. And this being a game, one has to learn how to play it. And so even with the old and the new money, I think basically what the world is offering Africa right now without really knowing it's offering Africa is the opportunity of old and new money, old being Europe, West, new being China, India, and others. So for me, I think it's for Africa to take advantage and take advantage. And then maybe if I was to challenge Europe or Europeans, I would simply ask them, why not do what you're doing in Asia? Because right now you'll see even German companies engaging 200,000 Indians, 300,000 Indians for innovation. But when it comes to Africa, they say, nope, let's send GIZ. I would say, please, let's turn that game and also recognize that Africans have solutions and therefore tap into these solutions. But from the recognition that it's a game. So Africans have the agency to take charge of, understand how this game is being played, but at the same time recognize history with its importance. And I still think that the tools that have been developed for purposes of serving Western industry, or what they call Western capitalism, are tools that Africans can study and tweak to their advantage. And so for me, I don't give up on the conversation on history. I see history giving us lessons of how to move to the next step. Thank you.
Thank you. So we are basically at the point where we were yesterday when we learned that history prepares for the future. Thank you very much for being with us, and I guess it's time for coffee.
Dankeschön.